immunity, you're not going to do anything. You're going to become a ceremonial president.
The question of presidential immunity goes before the U.S. Supreme Court as the New York criminal case against former President Donald Trump resumes in Manhattan.
Main complaint is let's get the weapons there as quickly as possible. I apologize for how long it took Congress to do its part.
Hello, I'm Ed O'Keefe, CBS News in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Two courts, two historic cases involving former President Donald Trump. Today, the U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments in his claim that the presidents have total immunity. His lawyers arguing he shouldn't face prosecution for anything he did while in office. We'll review what the justices may decide to do now. But as one of them said today, quote, "We're writing a rule for the ages." At the exact same time in New York City, Trump spent another day in a courtroom as a longtime friend continued to testify against him in his criminal hush money trial.
We're writing a rule for the ages.
We have a big case today. This judge isn't allowing me to go. We have a big case today in the Supreme Court on presidential immunity. A president has to have immunity. If you don't have immunity, you just have a ceremonial president.
CBS News legal correspondent Jan Crawford, who's outside the Supreme Court. Jan, good evening to you. The former president is claiming he has absolute immunity. Walk us through what you heard from Trump's defense team about how they support that claim.
Well, I mean, that is a sweeping argument, right? It is what it says, absolute immunity. That means that he cannot be prosecuted for any of his official acts while he was president. And obviously, because that is a sweeping argument, the justices really kind of drilled down on who and what that would mean for future presidents. You quoted and played that clip from Justice Gorsuch, but that was a real focus of the justices today. Nearly 3 hours of arguments. It was history. This case, their decision will go well beyond Donald J. Trump and will apply to all future presidents. So the idea that a president could be absolutely immune from anything while in office was very troubling to many of the justices who emphasized that the president is not above the law. The framers did not include immunity in the Constitution because obviously, as Justice Kagan said, they were worried about a monarch and thinking about that system. That's not the system we have here. So you saw a lot of kind of pushback on what that would mean if a president could go into the Oval Office and know they could do anything. As Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson said, it would kind of turn the Oval Office potentially into a seat of criminal activity. But Ed, on the flip side, and why, again, the justices are looking at this case well beyond Trump, they're also concerned about the law being weaponized against presidents, that presidents could be prosecuted for almost anything once they leave office that could affect how they govern. And so I think what they're working for here is some kind of middle ground where there may be some immunity for some official acts, and that's what they've got to decide.
Right, because what's the definition of that and what's the scope of it? I want to play again to reinforce this belief that the magnitude of this case is going to be quite profound. The attorney for Special Counsel Jack Smith, who argued before the High Court, and Trump-appointed Justice Neil Gorsuch went back and forth a little bit about how this case could be applied in the future. Let's take a listen.
I'm not concerned about this case, but I am concerned about future uses of the criminal law to target political opponents based on accusations about their motives.
There seemed to be sort of a tension between the justices concerned about the magnitude of this and how it applies to future presidents, and maybe a preference or the argument that if you just dealt with Trump in a vacuum, that would allow everything to proceed. And clearly that did not necessarily go over well with most of the justices, right?
Right. And I mean, I think that, people who have been, frustrated that why is the court, the court has expedited this case. They've agreed to the special counsel's request to hear arguments this term with a decision by June. They didn't put it on the calendar for next year. Why can't they do it faster? I mean, the Supreme Court, when they have arguments and then they decide cases, that is precedent that is binding. That's going to be binding on the next president and future presidents down the road. So, they're looking at this on how this is going to be interpreted and applied long after they have left, the court. And so that kind of exchange that you heard there and that you played with Justice Gorsuch, we heard Justice Kavanaugh talking about that, Justice Alito saying, this the specter of prosecuting former presidents. Look, we see that, if we look around the world, and you'll see people, they throw them in jail after they, lose an election. And so that, could be kind of fundamentally undermining our democracy. But again, you also had the other side with other justices, again, emphasizing, but no president is above the law.
Right. Real quick, Trump wanted to be there today. The judge in New York wouldn't let him go because by law he has to be at the criminal trial. Does it matter that he wasn't in Washington today listening to the high court?
Oh, yeah. Yes. I think that was great for Donald Trump. And that's why his lawyers, he wanted to come to the last case that they had involving Donald Trump and whether Colorado could kick him off the ballot. Remember that one? They decided a couple months ago, and his lawyers talked him out of coming. And he's lucky that the judge said, no, you can't go, because I think had he been sitting there in the courtroom, it makes it a lot harder for the justice to kind of focus on, and this is in Trump's interest, actually, to focus on how this is going to apply to other presidents. It's not just Donald Trump. So, I mean, I think that the judge probably did him a solid there, even though, he said he wanted to be here.
All right. Jan Crawford, our chief legal correspondent who covers the high court like no other here at CBS. We appreciate it. CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa joins us now from Lower Manhattan. Bob, you've been in the courthouse today. How badly did the former president want to be in Washington instead today?
It was evident, Ed, this morning when former President Trump showed up at a construction site that he would much rather be on the campaign trail. But, of course, he is here in Lower Manhattan, sitting inside the courthouse behind me all day, listening to testimony by his longtime associate, David Pecker, the former National Enquirer publisher. And he's mandated to sit there. This is a criminal trial. This is an issue that the Trump campaign is dealing with across the board when it comes to scheduling the presumptive Republican nominee's campaign. He can only really have rallies on the weekend and on Wednesdays.
And amid all this, you're outside one of essentially 4 cases involving him or his associates today, all of which have had developments. In Arizona, for example, the Democratic Attorney General has indicted 18 people in its 2020 election interference case, including now former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and the former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani. What does that mean for Trump himself and more broadly for his campaign?
For former President Trump, this is a cascading series of challenges he continues to face each and every day. It's Arizona late last night with some of his Republican allies and former assistants and former advisors in the White House being charged for trying to come up with a fake elector scheme. It's the Supreme Court now dealing with presidential immunity, everything that's happening here in New York. This is a field of challenges for Trump to go across, a thicket of things he has to deal with. But at the same time, he's competitive in the polls. And so for the Democrats, as they look at all this, you don't see President Biden, who you cover so closely, focusing on this in any real way politically. But it's this blizzard of challenges that they're just saying it represents a chaotic candidate who would, again, be a chaotic president in the Democrats' view. And perhaps there's a view among some Democratic strategists that ultimately all of this will be a burden on Trump's shoulders, and it could affect how voters perceive Trump, whether they want to have another 4 years with someone with this kind of personality, this kind of legal peril on his own horizon. But there's no guarantee for Democrats that all of these legal challenges will ultimately make Trump pay a political price.
No, there's not. That's a good point. We should point out the president was in upstate New York today for yet another announcement tied to the various pieces of legislation passed in recent years, part of his legacy that he's trying to campaign on. Real quick, in yet another Trump case, this one involving the author E. Jean Carroll, a federal judge denied Trump's request for a new trial in her civil defamation suit. Can he appeal that decision?
Trump says he is going to continue to fight on all fronts, whether it's civil, criminal, state, local, federal. This is a combative legal strategy across the board. You can't really be a Trump lawyer and not have a combative posture when it comes to the appellate process. And so we're seeing that from all my sources close to Trump, that he is going to keep pushing for this trial to be dismissed, for different damages that have been awarded to people who have sued him to be either dismissed or shrunk in some way. And so this is going to be the story of the rest of the year. Trump in court, the courtroom as the campaign trail, Trump dealing with the legal challenges, which have some interest to voters, but really aren't kitchen table issues. But all of it becomes this stew that affects our entire political climate.
Yeah, and real quick, those sources you talked to, how do they describe his mood right now?
His mood is pretty passive inside the courtroom because the judge has a gag order. He can't be grumbling. He can't be making comments. And the prosecution is keeping a close eye on Trump every second. Anything he does could put him in jeopardy when it comes to financial penalties, maybe even a more severe penalty from this judge. So he's pretty quiet in the courtroom. Outside of the courtroom, not so much.
Robert Costa there in Lower Manhattan tracking the Trump hush money criminal trial. Thank you, sir. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Lawyers for former President Trump arguing today in front of the Supreme Court that he should have absolute immunity from criminal prosecution. Next, we're joined by the former president's co-counsel for more on today's arguments. Stay with us. You're streaming America Decides. As we were discussing, attorneys representing former President Donald Trump argued to the U.S. Supreme Court Thursday that all presidents should have total immunity from criminal prosecution. We're joined now by one of those attorneys, Will Scharf. He's also a Republican candidate for Attorney General in Missouri, and he was in the highest court today. Good to see you, sir. Thank you for being here after a busy day.
Great to be with you.
It is the belief of your team that any president should have total immunity for official acts.
For official acts in office, and that's a very important distinction, as you know. Nobody here is arguing that presidents should have absolute immunity for their private conduct. But for official acts, acts that fall within the outer perimeter of a president's responsibilities in office, we believe that a president should have immunity, that without that immunity, the presidency itself would be crippled, and that no future American president would be able to effectively discharge his duties while suffering under the specter of potential criminal prosecution in the future.
Do you believe, listening to what you listened to, observing what you observed, that at least 5 justices agree with you?
I think the court was very interested at testing the bounds of immunity and was very skeptical of the arguments advanced by the special counsel's team that no immunity at all can exist, that a president should have absolutely no immunity for his official acts. So we were, I'd say, cautiously optimistic coming out of the court today that they see this issue as we do, that not recognizing immunity would do serious damage to the presidency.
What's striking about your argument, though, is that during the proceedings, your colleague conceded some of the allegations against the former president are not for official acts.
We've always conceded that there may be private conduct at stake, and that for private conduct, immunity would not extend. But again, some of the core allegations in this case involve things like asking the Department of Justice to investigate election fraud, considering an appointment to the position of acting attorney general. We consider those to be quintessentially presidential acts, and if immunity were not extended for acts like that, again, we believe that the presidency would be crippled.
But what about seeking clarity on election interference is an official presidential duty?
Well, the president has a take-care obligation under Article 2 of the Constitution to ensure that federal election law is enforced. I think it's an absolutely essential function of the presidency to ensure that we have a fair and unbiased election system. And so certainly investigating election fraud or considering leadership at the Department of Justice that would be more aggressive in investigating election fraud, we believe would fall within the ambit of the outer perimeter test set forth by the Supreme Court in Nixon v. Fitzgerald, the seminal case on civil immunity in the presidential context.
Okay, but so some of what he's alleged, your team argued or conceded, was private conduct, correct?
That's correct, but it was interesting. The lawyer for the special counsel's team, Michael Dreeben, effectively conceded that the indictment, as it's currently laid out, intermixes private conduct and official conduct to the extent that certainly at the very least, if any official immunity and any presidential immunity is recognized here by the court, we think a remand for further proceedings to sort of tease the bounds of that immunity would be absolutely necessary.
So then how do you argue that in lower court? How do you argue over the immunity issue at that point?
Well, the D.C. Circuit actually issued pretty good guidance in the Blazing Aim opinion last year, which was a presidential civil immunity case. They set out a test that looks at the function and official indicia of various acts, and that's currently an issue being litigated in D.C. courts. We think that provides a perfect model for the court here.
You are a member of the Trump legal team in terms of the immunity issue specifically, right?
I'm on President Trump's appellate team. We've worked on a lot of issues for him.
Do you foresee the Arizona election interference case ending up in your lap at some point?
I don't know. I mean, that's obviously the indictment was just returned yesterday. I would say that I think it's very interesting that once again we have an elected Democrat pushing a highly political prosecution at the height of election season. I think that's just wrong. I think when you look at all of these cases against President Trump, they smack of election interference and political motivations. As a former federal prosecutor, I was trained that prosecutions are never supposed to be political. They're never even supposed to appear political. I think we see the exact opposite playing out in courtrooms across America.
See, that's when you say that, the Democrat looking into election interference, wouldn't it have been a Republican president and a Republican Justice Department looking into election interference when he was still president? Isn't it all political? All of this is partisan at this point.
I fundamentally disagree that our courts and that the rule of law should be applied through the lens of partisan politics. I think that's banana republic stuff. And I think that's unfortunately the road that President Biden and his allies have set us down over the last couple of years. I think it would be really important for the future of the republic for the court to issue firm guidance on the issue of presidential immunity. And I'm hopeful that as we continue litigating all of these cases, we're able to vindicate the rule of law in a non-political way so that, frankly, the American Republic will last.
All right. Will Scharf, running for Attorney General in a competitive Republican primary, we should point out, but today a co-counsel for the former president of the Supreme Court. Thank you for spending part of the day here.
Thanks for having me.
All righty. Take care. Pope Francis sat down with CBS News for a global exclusive interview this week. It's his first ever major interview with a U.S. TV network. The Pope had a message for the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin. Take a listen.
Do you have a message for Vladimir Putin when it comes to Ukraine?
Por favor.
Please.
En los países en guerra.
Countries at war, all of them.
Detengan la guerra. Busquen.
Stop the war. Look to negotiate. Look for peace. A negotiated peace is better than a war without end.
The Pope also discussed the ongoing war between Israel and Gaza, and Hamas, climate change, and other topics. You can watch an extended version of CBS Evening News anchor Norah O'Donnell's interview with Pope Francis on Sunday, May 19th on 60 Minutes.
Well, one of the things I apologize for is it's taken too long.
That's Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell on his conversation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He speaks with our Margaret Brennan about that apology and more. Stay with us. You're streaming America Decides. Mitch McConnell says providing aid for Ukraine is one of the most important legislative victories of his career. The Senate Minority Leader sat down with Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan only a day after President Biden signed into law a $95 billion foreign aid package that encompasses this aid. Here's some of their discussion.
I understand you just hung up with Ukraine's President Zelensky. The U.S. has shipped him capabilities, including these long-range missiles, as part of this new congressional aid package. What did he say to you? Does he need more specific weapons in the immediate term?
Well, one of the things I apologize for is it's taken too long. If you go back to the beginning of this administration, even though I supported, obviously, this supplemental request and worked hard to get Republican votes for it, this all started with the precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's like sending out the green light to all the rogue regimes around the world that the Americans are going home. Number two, not giving the Ukrainians what they need soon enough. Didn't just start with this administration. I remember the Obama administration sent them meals ready to eat. It's not exactly a way to defend yourself.
Following the 2014 partial invasion.
Yeah. So it's gradually gotten better. The administration's still been self-deterring themselves with some fear that the Russians would be deterred by our lack of action. So my main complaint is let's get the weapons there as quickly as possible. I apologize for how long it took Congress to do its part, but we finally did. And he was also impressed by the fact that Republican support grew in the Senate substantially.
Because you were whipping those votes. You convinced 9 additional senators.
I tried to it wasn't something I felt lightly about, let's put it that way.
But who did you feel you were apologizing for?
The slowness of it.
But that wasn't in the Senate.
I'm sorry?
The slowness was not in the Senate. Were you apologizing for House Republicans?
No, it was in the Senate. We spent about 4 months trying to agree to a deal to deal with our own border with Mexico, which is a disaster. And initially, obviously, to make a law, you have to deal with the other side. They've got the White House, they've got the Senate. We came up with a proposal. It was, my members felt, many of them, were not good enough. Our nominee for president seemed to be unenthusiastic about acting on that. And so that took 3 or 4 months. Once we realized we were not going to be able to legislate on the border, we bored in on the subject of the supplemental. And I think a number of my members focusing on that changed their mind. And we grew from 22 to actually 32. One member missed the last vote, but would have voted for it.
And CBS News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Margaret Brennan joins us now. Of course, she is also the moderator of Face the Nation. Watching that interview, Margaret, a viewer should probably take away from this that the Senate leader's on a bit of a victory lap when it comes to Ukraine.
Absolutely. It is very clear that Mitch McConnell shares with Joe Biden the view that we are at a significantly dangerous moment in time on the world stage, and that America needs to lead in that by being, as he referred back to it, the arsenal of democracy. That's why he was really trumpeting the ability that he had to get this package done, the $61 billion of it for Ukraine. But at the same time, Ed, what is so notable is that he had to apologize for his own party. I didn't have to press him to do that. He did. He said he apologized to Volodymyr Zelensky for it taking so long because of the infighting in the Senate and then in the House. And it's significant because he went farther than that and actually acknowledged there was battlefield impact. The Supreme Allied Commander, the head of NATO forces, General Kaboli, has testified to Congress that the Russian army has reconstituted its defense industrial base, that they've actually reinforced the positions in the 20% of Ukraine that they hold. And McConnell said, yes, we bear some responsibility for that. I thought that was significant. Yeah. But to your point, he's using it as victory lap to say, I defeated the forces of isolationism within the Republican Party on this one particular issue. And he said the best evidence of how we're doing pushing on isolationism is the difference between 22 and 32. He's counting votes between how the Senate supplemental passed in the fall and then when they just voted on it again this week, that he has actually drawn up Republican support despite Donald Trump. And he tried to avoid mentioning Mr. Trump. He said the Republican frontrunner, and he said it was helpful that he stopped whipping against Ukraine aid.
And while you were talking to him on this incredibly important issue, there was another one playing out literally across the street at the Supreme Court.
Literally across the street.
Any chance you two discuss that one as well?
We did. We'll have some of that for you on Sunday. You're talking about the question the Supreme Court is debating in terms of presidential immunity or presidential immunity for someone who once was in office, Donald Trump, who's arguing that because he was not convicted by the Senate for the offenses on which he was impeached, that therefore he can't face prosecution in a criminal context either. And who led that effort for the Senate not to convict? Mitch McConnell. So while Mitch McConnell is not a fan of Donald Trump, he is key to Donald Trump's defense as to why is he not responsible for January 6th. McConnell stuck with his assessment of Mr. Trump, and you'll hear it again on Sunday.
All right. How's that for a tease? Margaret Brennan, thank you for bringing us a taste of it. And you can, of course, see the rest of it, her interview with Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell on America's #1 Sunday public affairs show, we should note, Face the Nation, this Sunday, right here on CBS News 24/7. We're tracking a third case involving former President Donald Trump tonight. A federal judge hands down a decision on a motion for a new trial in the E. Jean Carroll case. Remember that one? What it means for that massive $83 billion judgment. You're streaming America Decides. For the former president, it's a tale of two cities. Here in Washington, the Supreme Court heard arguments on his claim of a president's total immunity from prosecution for actions taken while in office. Up in New York, Trump returned to court for more testimony in his criminal hush money trial. All right, let's keep this up now and talk to Shelby Talcott and Finn Gomez. They join me now. Shelby, politics reporter for Semaphore, which is a publication the color of Finn Gomez's tie. He is CBS News political director. If you've ever been to the Semaphore website, you know what I'm talking about.
I love his tie.
Good to see both of you. Big week, big day in a big week, and a week that sort of is reflective of where campaign 2024 is going. We'll get to that in a second. Let's talk first about this Arizona election interference case. It's sprung up again. We got Rudy Giuliani, Boris Epstein, John Eastman, Mark Meadows, names we've heard in the past, suddenly back in the news because it appears they're not named in the indictment, right? But they appear to have been charged. What does this do for Trump, not only maybe in the Grand Canyon state, but overall? Does this even matter at this point?
Well, that's a good question. And I think ultimately the important thing is that this is the fourth state to bring charges like this. And so it just underscores how big this alleged scheme was, which of course relates back to some of Donald Trump's own legal issues, even if he is not indicted in this specific Arizona case. Also, I think it's notable that a few of these people who were indicted, right, Rudy Giuliani, Boris Epstein, Christina Bobb, they're still in Donald Trump's orbit, right?
Yeah.
Christina Bobb was
Actively.
just named as the senior counsel to the RNC's election integrity unit.
Right.
And so what does that mean for her role? What does that mean for the RNC's role? Boris Epstein is one of Donald Trump's sort of top legal aides. What does that mean for what he can do with all of these other ongoing cases? So I do think it affects Donald
And
Trump's...
he was there today.
Exactly.
He was there at his table today.
I do think it affects Donald Trump's other cases. And it also just underscores, as you said, what this entire election is becoming, which is just a slew, an onslaught of various legal problems.
For him, and then for the president, he's out doing the job of being president, right? We were talking about this earlier today here in the office.
Like I spoke to both sides today, you know, and from sources within the Biden campaign, they say that of course they're loving this split screen between Donald Trump at the courthouse and Joe Biden at the White House, right? They're seeing that, and not just there, like Joe Biden's talking about issues. They're saying the issues that matter in this cycle, abortion rights in Tampa, in Donald Trump's home state now, right? He's being pugilistic on the campaign trail. They're talking about big foreign aid, of course, that was signed. That was a big win for him, they say, and of course being like surrounded by his union endorsers yesterday here as well here in D.C. They love this split screen. Of course, I did speak to a Trump campaign source who also says that for them, this is the gift that keeps on giving. They're talking about what's happening in Arizona. They're talking about what's happening with SCOTUS. They feel that really good that this is actually going to get kicked back to the appeals level or back to Chutkin, and it's not going to happen before November 5th. They feel really strongly about that, and politically they feel really good about what they believe is a overreach in Arizona as well.
And Joe Biden's campaign is notably not really directly attacking Donald Trump over these legal issues. And that is, I think, in part because they don't want to add to Donald Trump's argument that this is politically motivated, but also because there is this natural split screen. So they feel they don't have to. They can focus on the issues that American voters are concerned about and let Donald Trump do his thing.
I think we failed to see here in Washington the resonance of the decision this week to change overtime pay rules, the end of non-compete clauses, those kinds of things that conceivably put money in the pocket of working class Americans. We're going to hear about that and realize current government did that. The Biden government did that while Trump's in courtrooms. I mean, they may not draw the immediate distinction, but it's those kinds of things that they hear about happening that they go, oh, that's kind of a big deal.
And I think the question is, does that end up being front of mind for American voters over things that the Donald Trump's campaign is arguing, which is the economy, the cost of gas, kitchen table issues. And so it's really interesting, and it's sort of setting up this debate over that.
We have a minute to go, both of you. What is the latest on him picking a running mate, Trump? And why isn't that person potentially picked and already out on the road campaigning while he's stuck in a courtroom. Seems like a lost opportunity.
Yeah, I was talking to several sources in the Trump world and on the Trump campaign just over the last couple of days who say that it's a jump ball. Like it's, you know,
who are the names?
The names I'm hearing, though, are Tim Scott, of course, a South Carolina senator, former competitor. I'm hearing Marco Rubio. I was, quote, told it's real. And also that there might be some others, including
Doug Burgum.
Doug Burgum, yes, Doug Burgum, the North Dakota senator, governor, who also ran for president as well. But
and Sarah Huckabee Sanders, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Sarah Huckabee Sanders is on the list, but it's a long list.
Lower list. It is a long list. And the last thing I'll say on that is, at the end of the day, though, Donald Trump's team is not convinced that they need to pick a vice presidential candidate that would help him. They don't know that that will matter. And so that might not be as big of a factor as we think.
All right.
It's been a long time until we hear that.
Shelby and Finn, thank you for being here. We appreciate it.
Every single expert, every legal scholar, every respected scholar has said this is no case. There is no case here. This is just a political witch hunt.
From New York to Washington, we're breaking down the legal cases involving former President Donald Trump. A closer look next with a legal mind we like to turn to. You're streaming America Decides. As we've been reporting, the Supreme Court is hearing arguments on whether former President Donald Trump can be prosecuted for actions taken while in office. Notably missing from the hearing was Trump himself. The former president appeared in court in New York instead, as the judge there told him he has to for continued testimony in his criminal trial. Former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Tom Dupree, someone we turn to every so often on things like this, joins us now. Good to see you in person.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so your big takeaways from what we saw today at the Supreme Court.
Oh my gosh, 3 hours of constitutional argument. I could have listened to 8. I love this stuff, but it was a long day. It was a long day. Look, the Supreme Court asked the sorts of questions we anticipated they would ask. They really were probing the scope of the immunity that former President Trump could plausibly claim. There were a lot of great, thoughtful questions, tough questions for both sides, and the Supreme Court was interested both in understanding historically how the framers understood the Constitution to work in terms of giving the president or not giving the president immunity, and they also were very focused on the practical consequences of a ruling either way. What would happen if they ruled for Trump, or what would happen if they ruled against Trump for future presidents?
So earlier in the program, we heard from Trump's co-counsel, and he said the team is cautiously optimistic and that they think the court appeared skeptical of the special counsel's arguments. Would you agree, or did you hear something different?
I think they're right to be cautiously optimistic. I think that the justices' questions showed a receptivity to the idea that there needs to be some degree of immunity for a former president. I don't think they're going to go the full distance that former President Trump would like them to do. He was advocating a very aggressive version of immunity. I don't think the court is ready to go that far. But based on the questions today, it does seem likely that they are going to recognize some scope of presidential immunity, the contours of which have yet to be determined.
So the language used to lay out what exactly this is, it was limited to the following question. Follow along here, kids. Whether, and if so, to what extent, does a former president enjoy presidential immunity from criminal prosecution for conduct alleged to involve official acts during his tenure in office? We're going to leave that on screen for a second because it's a mouthful. That's a very specific thing to have to work to ponder now, with only about 2 months to go in this Supreme Court term.
That's exactly right. And there is a heck of a lot of meaning packed within that short sentence.
Yeah.
I think one issue that really captivated the justice's attention today was trying to draw the line between what acts are official acts, or in legal terms, core acts of the president that might be protected by immunity, as opposed to acts that would not be. And I think a lot of the justices were expressing questions. Well, what about this act? Which side of the line would that fall on? What about this act? And so you heard the lawyers today fighting off a seemingly incessant series of hypotheticals about how would this case be resolved, and doing their best to give answers.
So do we think now they're going to go sit around the table and go, okay, guys, let's put a list together. Assassinating someone, probably not immune from that, right? A cabinet appointment, that's immune, right? But, like, is that what they do now?
Well, see, that's the beauty of being a Supreme Court justice. You don't have to make that list yourself. You can basically tell the lower courts they have to do that list, or they have to parse the allegations in the indictment to figure out which claims might be subject to immunity or not. Supreme Court could do that, but they'd simply like to, a lot of times you'll see them announce a legal standard, then leave it to the lower courts to flesh it out in practice.
So then how long does this take?
Well, if that's the road they take, it will take a while.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court will probably not render its decision in this case for, at least another month, maybe not until mid to late June. Once that happens, if in fact they send it back to the lower courts for more analysis, well, then we're talking probably weeks, but more likely months before that task is complete and a trial could potentially restart.
And then you're going to hear another great round of constitutional conversation in a courtroom, and guys like you get really excited about it.
Well, I plead guilty to that.
Don Dupree, great to have you here. Thank you.
Thanks.
A memorial service was held today for the 7 World Central Kitchen aid workers who were killed in an Israeli strike in Gaza. The organization's founder, Jose Andres, vowed that their work would never be forgotten.
But I promise you, we will not forget what they did for the hungry and for the world. Their example should inspire us to do better.
Israel says the April 1st strike was a mistake. The World Central Kitchen's convoy was hit while they were attempting to distribute food in the enclave. The United Nations says more than 220 humanitarian aid workers have been killed since the start of the Israel-Hamas war. Will he stay or will he go? We're tracking the political future of a certain European leader and why he's considering quitting the job. This is a good one. You're streaming America Decides. Attorneys for an American man imprisoned for nearly 2 years by the Taliban without being charged are asking the United Nations to help free him. Lawyers say Ryan Corbett is being subjected to torture after being abducted in Afghanistan in August 2022. They're now asking a human rights investigator at the UN to contact the Taliban and request his immediate release. The Biden administration is separately working on getting Corbett home and has designated him as wrongfully detained. Also on Wednesday, the president met with 4-year-old Abigail Moore Edan and her family at the White House. You may recall Abigail was held hostage by Hamas for 50 days. It was the youngest hostage to be released. Look at that photo. And in some political news from overseas, next week, the Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez, says he'll announce whether or not he's resigning following the launch of a judicial investigation into his wife. Begoña Gomez has been accused of using her position as the spouse of the Spanish leader to influence business deals. The Prime Minister denied the corruption allegations on Wednesday, but then said he must weigh, quote, if it is worth it to continue. Prime Minister Sanchez has cleared his public agenda to spend the next few days sorting out what to do, and is expected to announce a decision on Monday. That'll make for some interesting conversation at home. Back here in Washington, there's been a big focus this week at the White House on climate change, given that Earth Day was on Monday, and this is considered Climate Week. Our Major Garrett had the opportunity to speak with one of President Biden's top climate advisors, Ali Zaidi, for the next episode of The Takeout. Here's some of their discussion.
When we asked these people who identified climate as a very important issue to them, and asked them, how much have you heard or read about Biden policies on this issue that you care about, 49% answered, not much, nothing. 10% said a lot. That sounds to me like a problem for you.
Look, I think we've gone through a moment where there's been a lot of big news, right? We came in, the president talked about the multiple crises that face the country, the COVID pandemic looming the largest for a lot of Americans. Then we went through an economic revitalization, rebuilding supply chains, getting people back in jobs. So it was shots in arms, then it was people back on their feet economically, big pieces of business. And then in the backdrop, massive things taking place internationally, including Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Right, but
so
let me stop you right there.
Yeah.
The people we are talking to are not the generic Americans. They're the people who are hungry to read about this, who I've identified this as a high priority item, and they're still not hearing it.
Yeah, I don't know what to say about that other than to us pushing harder and harder to reach them, because from day one, the president signed us back into Paris. A few months later, he brought the
Paris Climate Accord,
the Paris Climate Accord, which the previous administration left. A few months later, he brought the whole world together, major economies around emissions reductions at the White House, set a target to reduce emissions by 50%. that fall, he went to the Glasgow Climate Conference, brought folks together around reducing methane emissions and slowing down deforestation. He then passed a bipartisan infrastructure law, which invested the biggest investment ever in resilience, in grid, in getting lead pipes out, in EV charging nationwide network. Then, continued past the Inflation Reduction Act, a massive piece of legislation that sparked 2,000 projects already constructed because of the president's leadership.
Major Garrett with White House climate advisor Ali Zaidi on The Takeout. You can watch the full episode this Sunday right here on CBS News 24/7. Now, before we go, today is Bring Your Child to Work Day across the country. Based off the original event, you may recall, Take Our Daughters to Work Day, which started in the early 90s by Marie C. Wilson, the former president of Miss Foundation for Women. Wilson wanted young women to see the possibilities of what they could achieve. Well, CBS News took part in bringing some of our kids to the White House today. Staff tracks down the latest news in our government. Don't they look adorable, those little ones? There were a handful of kids on hand at the White House today. And next door in the Eisenhower Executive Office building. Our thanks to the White House for letting us bring them along. That is not the real vice president, for the record. But the kids sure seem to enjoy seeing it nonetheless. And a great tradition at CBS News of continuing to bring the kids along, at least for the day, not only here in the newsroom, but over at the White House as well. That does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern. I'm Ed O'Keefe in Washington. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.